So hi everyone, thank you for joining the privacy talk. I invited Mr. Hector from Portland. He's a very great practitioner, especially for public sectors, the city, then open data. So I was a big administration from his work. Then I'm happy to invite him to have an interview on this show. So Hector, thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. First of all, I'd like to share his profile. Hector comes from a mixed background of entrepreneurship, research, and nonprofit organizations with expertise on the Internet of Things, advanced analytics, robotics, and automation and artificial intelligence. Hector has developed sensor networks for agriculture, food production, forest monitoring, and oil industry. Hector has a PhD in mechanical engineering with a focus on manufacturing, solar concentrators, and sustainable manufacturing. So it's a very curiosity. Thank you for having talk, Hector, this moment.
Yeah, I'm actually very curious about how this conversation is taking us.
Awesome. So let's move on to the interview agenda today. I'm so curious of your career since you have some engineering background, as well as you have working on the city of the Portland. So could you share about your history? Why did you start the work on the city of the Portland?
Yeah, well, that's a long history. I have to say that as well as a framework, I am an immigrant here in the US. I'm originally coming from Mexico. So my native language is not English, it's Spanish. And as an immigrant, so I also experienced a lot of what other immigrants here in this country live through, not being a citizen or participating fully in all the democratic activities in the city. That also gives me a different perspective on how we interact with technology, we interact with how we integrate ourselves in this community here in Portland. So as you mentioned by reading my bio, that I'm coming from engineering. I'm coming from a mixture between academic work and the startup community. So I'm an engineer. I like building things. I have to also mention that I lived in Japan. I was part of this exchange program between Mexico and Japan in 1999, where I went to Cuba to work on and learn pretty much about robotics engineering and automation. That gave me also one of my very initial exposures to another community different to mine, another culture different to mine, and learn how to navigate through all that. So my own interests back in my hometown in Mexico. My hometown is Jalapa. It's in the state of Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico. And much of my family actually work on agriculture, like rural areas. They had sugarcane and coffee farms here and there. Even though my core family lived in the city, we very often went there. And I grew up also very close to in the 80s to people who were actually doing permaculture and organic agriculture. Even though so my nature is doing and working with machines, I have this other mindset where I recognize that nature is very important. We need to work with nature all the time. And that has been, part of my motivation on why I started like doing things on trying to apply technology in agriculture, technology in food production, technology in fish farms, for instance, in Mexico, and try to support farmers, building information networks in Mexico around that, sensor networks and all that. And then there was a point where when I just came here to Portland, I co-founded a company called Smart Vineyards. So Smart Vineyards was doing sensor networks to help farmers to manage water irrigation for agriculture, for grapevine production. And then, well, the project was there for a number of years, about like 4 or 5 years. Then we started having, it's a startup environment. We started having issues with the business itself, with our business model, with technology. And then it came the opportunity to join the city within the Smart Cities program. And because of my background and my own personal interest, I decided to move from the startup now to start working with public sector. And yeah, I joined the city of Portland as the open data coordinator. And open data means trying in the government to proactively release data and information that government uses for decision making in an open way. So everything is available. However, the very first question that we asked ourselves was what is really open and what is not open, which took us to start working on privacy. And because privacy is a human right, my program, Smart Cities, the Smart Cities program, started working in collaboration with our Office of Equity and Human Rights here in Portland. And this has been the partnership that we started since 2018. And with that, we have been doing all this work together.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Since the Portland is one of the cities is admired by the Japanese people because it's a very great design and a very great environment and circumstances for the Japanese to take and relax in it's a very kind of the compact cities for us. I think you involved in a Portland is a smart city PDX. Maybe that's a kind of the great initiative to lead of the smart city designing in Portland. So could you tell us your work at this initiative, and also you are involved in the open data ecosystem in Portland. So could you share the details about that?
Yeah. So Smart City PDX, Smart Cities program here in Portland was created after the federal government in the US had this Smart Cities challenge around transportation in 2016, where, it was a big award, $40 million to the city who could actually propose the best project. At the time, Portland started working with the Bureau of Transportation, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, in collaboration with some community organizations. And they put together a project around this idea of bringing transportation services in equitable ways, so that serves everybody, regardless of who you are. And then the city actually was one of the finalists for the challenge back in 2016, but the Portland didn't win. So it was Columbus, Ohio, who won the award. However, there was a big collective effort, such a big collective effort that the city decided to create the Smart Cities program as a way to start looking into these emerging technologies back then. So, and it feels like a long time ago, but it's not too far. 2017 was when the Smart Cities program was created. And then with the Smart Cities program, the open data in Portland has also a really long time. So it was one of the very first cities in the US that had an open data ordinance, an open data policy. back in 2009. And back then, Portland lived a different ecosystem in terms of who were doing what. Open source software was having a very bright time then. So a lot of different companies were using and developing open source. Many people were working in collaboration around this idea. So it seemed back then, 2009, that would be a great solution for open data, open source, a great combination. However, back then, technology wasn't really ready for such an endeavor. Like you can imagine, servers, networking was slow, developing and maintaining open source was very expensive. There were not enough developers. So basically the project Open Data started to go down, and then it was idle for like a number of years, probably since 2012. And then when the smart cities came to life, that group decided to bring Open Data to life. And then, so it was Open Data joined the smart cities program. And that's how I got hired in 2018. And once I started working with Open Data, I started also like taking over privacy work and developing some privacy principles and all that. While the smart cities effort was also focused on back then trying to figure out how to use sensor networks, like for traffic monitoring, how to use sensors or technology for emergency preparedness, and earthquake happening here in Portland. And you know, it's all these different lessons learned where now back then the technology was not really ready. So it started like failing, like pilot projects didn't work out as expected. Claims around using artificial intelligence back in 2018, 19 weren't really giving the results as promised. So rather our program then shifted, and rather than focusing on these pilot projects, we started focusing on basic infrastructure for the city, on policy making. So with the time, we can actually could be working on all these different other issues and technology and be ready internally. And that's where we are right now. So after 5 years of work, we have a number of policies that are helping us to use technology in more responsible ways. And we are also starting to have this critical mass of people with all these different backgrounds, working on data, working on technology, that we hope we can start now like delivering the data products that the city needs.
Yeah, that's a very challenging to work in the public sector, that I assume it. I think an important trend is anonymously the past surveillance technology policy in recent you publish on your website, which is a very interesting actions from the privacy perspective, because it's in a very challenging how we can protect the consumer rights and the human rights against of the surveillance, but you are enacted of these political actions. So could you tell us why you could pass this new policy in Portland? And also there was some concerns of the facial recognitions, as you mentioned in 2020, around 2018. So could you tell us about it?
Yeah, you know, all those experiences that I was sharing before about technology failing, not giving the right, the promised deliverables or products that we were expecting, it started to create this skepticism, like not believing what the technology of vendors were claiming, and then there is like a mistrust, and this is just from our program to all that. Now, from the community perspective, obviously there is a different history, and And if you think about the cultural and historical context here in the US, where particularly Black people, indigenous people, immigrants, they get immigrants from all over the world, right? It doesn't matter. It's not only immigrants from the Americas, immigrants from the Middle East, Muslim countries, or sometimes immigrants from European immigrants. They get exposed to all these different issues around immigration and how personal data, when you are an immigrant, is being handled and used, sometimes without your consent or even you knowing what's happening, right? So there is a mistrust in many cases on how technology is being used. And the mistrust comes from, well, technology not working properly, but also mostly because we don't know how technology is being used. In the development of this surveillance technologies policy, we believe that it's very important to get public engagement and public participation, not only to get some input, initial input, but more for like co-designing the whole policy, right? For understanding what really happening. And we have been doing that since like 2019, when we started our privacy and information protection principles as a general guidelines for what we are doing now. And then the face recognition policy, which was back in 2019, once we finished the privacy and information protection principles, other cities back then, the city of San Francisco started banning the use of face recognition because of bias against people with dark skin color, older people, women. And so we got the task to start looking into that and help the city what to do, whether should, like, answering the question, should we ban the technology? Should we do something else? And we did for that policy about a year work, like doing engagement and informing people, doing organizing co-design events, working internally with our city leadership, with elected officials, with supervisors, middle management, with bureau directors, with practitioners, the ones who are going to potentially use the technology. So it was a lot of work. We did the same for the surveillance technologies policy. So at the end, I think we keep this kind of perfect track of having policies that pass unanimously because everybody is informed. Everybody has been participating in this process. Everybody knows what they're expecting. And the reality is that sometimes not everybody is sometimes nobody is really fully happy, but we are into a place where, okay, I can actually support this because this makes sense to me. It could be better, but that's the work that we need to keep doing. And particularly with this last policy, the surveillance technologies policy, it's very complex, right? Surveillance technologies has things to do around human rights, how technology is been evolving so quickly, and now with the use of artificial intelligence, many of those things go beyond what we can do as a city. However, we are starting with our starting point with this policy, and what we were proposing was, so for the first thing, we need to understand where we are, right? And we need to make sure everybody understands where we are. So next steps are well informed, and next steps, we know where we want to go, right? So this policy is actually focused on transparency and building some basic due processes for creating more information and more transparency. So we are going to build with this policy and a citywide inventory of all the surveillance technologies that we are using currently. And we are going to start implementing privacy impact assessments in new surveillance technologies when the city wants to procure or planning to use new surveillance technologies. So they need to come with a privacy impact assessment. We are not starting from zero. That's another thing that I should mention, is that networks with communications with other cities have been really important for this project because we don't need to reinvent anything. So we really are learning from other cities, which different from the private sector where there is a lot of information like intellectual property protection. In public sector is really open. So we actually have meetings with other cities in the West Coast. With the city of Seattle has been a great group that is advising us from the very beginning. So we have meetings with the city of Seattle, with San Francisco, with Oakland, with San Diego, with San Jose, Santa Clara County. And we also have meetings or belong to this international network of the Coalition of Cities for Digital Rights. It's mostly based in Europe, but includes the city of Barcelona, Amsterdam, New York City, Dublin, London, Berlin, Reykjavik, Helsinki, name it, in Europe. So it's quite extensive, and we share, and that's actually pretty cool because even though our contexts are very different, we have a lot of common. So what we are doing is just take the things that we can share with have been shared, and we adapt it and we use it. So that's a lot of time and resources saving.
Yeah, that's amazing work. Probably just to inform the citizen and stakeholders, I think they have the different perceptions of the surveillance of something, especially for maybe just in the local citizens to think that it's whether their data has been collected without any consent or something. It's been a kind of the concerns that they have. But the other stakeholders has a different type of the context. So how did you inform those stakeholders? You provide information the same level for each, or you customize the information to the different stakeholders on this case?
Yeah, it's both. I think we have common information for everybody that we share in social media. We share in our blog posts. We share with big email messages to everybody in our mailing list. And our mailing list includes private sector, small businesses, coalition of businesses, academic institutions and research institutions locally here in the Portland area or in Oregon, local advocacy groups and individuals, nonprofit organizations. So it's quite diverse. And of course, this is kind of the larger list at the end of that. So a more smaller group that stakeholders that are or shareholders that are more active in this area, they come together, they ask us questions, we have meetings and things like that. And then depending on who we are talking to, we actually can have one-to-one conversations. And of course, it's very different when there is the information that advocacy groups that is actually working around police issues, law enforcement issues, for instance, or immigrants issues, what they know or may understand about how artificial intelligence is going to impact them. So it's very different, the how we prepare the message, how we work with them. Sometimes we have actually done one-to-one educational, like for meetings for digital literacy, right? And sometimes because, well, I speak Spanish natively, we do it in Spanish. And in the future, hopefully, we can actually do it with other languages. For instance, there is a big Somali population here, and they have reached out to us, actually complaining that we don't have enough information in Somali, and they are right. And as well, Portland has is such a diverse community with everybody from all over the world, right? But the main languages spoken here are Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, mostly Cantonese, Ukrainian and Russian, yeah, and Somali. So there is obviously Iranian families that speak Persian, for instance, and yeah, so it's quite diverse, and that could be also an issue around how we manage our limited resources in our program. Now, this is from the community perspective. Now, there is a little bit different sometimes when we talk to the private sector, because private sector, we approach to a small business networks, which is very different when we talk to a food cart, for instance, a food cart owner, or somebody who's just having a small store in town, to when we're actually talking to a big corporation like Google or Amazon or Apple, that they have offices here, or Walmart that, well, recently just departed from Portland, but we were talking to Walmart for some of the face recognition policies, right? And issues. So, and we prepare the information that they need or they require from us. The Port of Portland, the airport also, for instance, other jurisdictions, because that's also important to clarify, because we as a city only have jurisdiction on what the city manages, which is parks, the right-of-way, the streets, things like that, but we don't manage schools, for instance. We don't manage the airport. We don't manage some of the natural reserves or spaces here, other than some parks here and there, you know? So it gets complicated at times, but yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine that's in a very tremendous effort that you have done. Owing into this striving that this current policy is the going effect. That's a very great achievement. We should like appreciate it that you are sharing the very great insight. So you mentioned about the principles about the privacy, especially for in Portland. I think that's a very great announcement. You set this principle before the creating the new initiative related to the smart city. So could you tell us about this information principle, as well as what is this for the smart city?
Yes, when we started all this work back in 2018, March 2018, so the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe was actually coming into effect, right? Europeans have this framework, legal framework now for a long time. And when we were doing, so the first thing that I started doing personally was looking into open data policy. And then one goal right away was, okay, we need to have some privacy principles. The city of Seattle has the oldest privacy office in the nation. It was actually established in 2015, so they had already a number of years, 3 years before us on all that. So we reach out to them, we look into the principles that Seattle had put together. And that was the important portion, because when we're looking into those principles, I was working with my colleague Judith Maury from the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and she mentioned, so this language is really not developed for from the perspective of the community. It's really just developed for protecting the city's liability, you know, like nobody's going to sue us and things like that. We should think about that differently. And then looking into what Europe had done, the GDPR had all these privacy rights based on, you know, it's an European philosophy around individual rights and all that. And so we tried, we say, what about if we have some privacy rights here in Portland? When we brought this idea to our city attorneys, they say no. Our city attorneys say no, privacy rights is going to take you a long time. They are legally binding to the city. It's a very hard lift. What about if we start with principles? And you know, it's been this series number of voices that, okay, we start with principles. We did with that idea, we organized a hackathon, an unconference. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but an unconference is basically like a conference, of course, but that everybody comes. There is a general topic. In our case, was civic data and privacy, but there is no specific like talks or rooms and things like that. So everybody who goes and attends the Anon conference, and we did something like that dynamics, just came and we started putting what we wanted to discuss in that event. So, and we group all these different topics together. We came out with like 4 or 5 different topics. We did breakout rooms, discussions, people were taking notes, people were like sharing resources, links, and things like that. And at the end of that process, we came up with a Google Doc with all those notes and all those links. And it was a really great starting point that we took that. The Ginger Ann Brewster, the Chief Privacy Officer from Seattle, came to Portland to help us also to figure things out. And with her leadership at the time, we started with what are the Portland values on that. We put together a list of our Portland values. We took all these different notes that we had, and then we translate that into the 7 privacy and information protection principles that we have now as a policy. And so we did some innovation there. So basically, we reframe it, the language for the principles. We took Seattle's principles, but reframed the language. Principles around transparency, principles around accountability, no discrimination, all these 5 principles. And then we added 2 new ones from this public event, public engagement, which was the data minimization. So we would only collect the minimum amount of information, and that minimum amount of information needs to bring value to the city and the communities that the city serve, and then automated decision systems. So algorithms, basically. So we need to look into the privacy concerns when we use an algorithm. We need to look into the whole life cycle of data and information. That includes like third parties, all these black boxes behind something. And that's how we put together our 7 privacy principles that also pass unanimously in our city council. So yeah, that was the story.
Yeah, that sounds interesting, especially for the you invited from other cities and just running from the essence. I think it's kind of the knowledge aggregation is a part of the very important to set up the principle to define of the local issues. I think just you mentioned on the website as well in terms of the privacy risk assessment. As you mentioned, that's the risk assessment is very important to induce the new technology, especially for the public interest. And they also you are defined as of the risk assessment with the separate pillars, such as you put on the initial threshold, the impact assessment, which is a very primary, I think, to define what kind of the risk is with suspicious is working on in the city development. So could you share about your risk assessment for the citizens in Portland?
Yeah, so risk assessments in the US have a really long history, right? So they're actually defined in the 1974 Privacy Act, 1974, so really long time, right? And they have been evolving. So obviously, doing a risk assessment, privacy risk assessment in 1974, well, it's very different to doing a risk assessment now. If somebody took a picture on the street in 1974, so you just have a print after that. You don't know anything about the people in the background of that picture, and only you and perhaps the group of friends, family, they may have access to that, right? Now, if anyone takes a picture with your smartphone, a backend application may actually be doing like face recognition, identification of people here and there. The file is geotagged, so the phone and whatever other system has access to that information knows where that was taken, what kind of device took it. I mean, there is a lot of information around that, right? So I think what we did with privacy risk assessments, again, very similarly to what we do in general, is we start looking into what's existing, who's doing what, and then I think there was another big factor there, because when we started designing our risk assessment process, COVID happened. So that was early 2020. So COVID happened, and one of the very, very first issues back in early 2020 was all these apps coming out to the world, claiming that they could actually be like contact tracing, like tracking people with COVID, tracking people with symptoms, telling everybody when somebody was contagious, name it, right? So one of the first questions is how we can actually protect people's data, people information, at the same time to be aware that some of those applications, when used properly, they can actually stop or slow down the risk of a pandemic. That didn't happen, obviously, but we started asking all these different questions. Some of these issues around the type of technology that we were using, who has access to the information, is that applicable in workers, in a labor kind of a space, then labor laws need to come into consideration for that, or is just like a commercial app that is doing that, or is really something that a clinic is actually doing for medical purposes. So there is a lot of context there. And then understanding, I think the first stage is we need to understand what is the context. And that's the first preliminary assessment that we do is about that. So we are trying to understand what is the assessment. And then once we understand, okay, maybe this case is not going to be collecting too much personal information, is very constrained, so it's low, it's not the surveillance technologies. So let's do this small assessment and we check. We are done, we are all fine, we are all good. Like higher risk applications, okay, we need them to do something deeper. What is what we can do? So at this time, we're actually we have been using some of the city of Seattle's templates for that. Again, they have 3-5 years in advantage from us, so we don't have to reinvent anything. Seattle has done it. We use it. We adapt it. The framework in Seattle is different again because that's a different state. So there are Washington laws. We need to translate that into Oregon laws. That's fine. And then some of the privacy assessments that we do for data actually come from San Francisco. San Francisco has a data toolkit, and some of these tools are actually for privacy assessment of data. So we have been using some of those, also adapting, same thing, we adapt those and we use it in our processes. Now, the latest that we are now trying to do is to standardize things, right? Seattle, for instance, the current assessment, we have 6 different subject areas in which we do the assessment that we're trying to standardize it and say, and ask the question, should we, instead of these 6 subject areas, should we use a more like a human rights approach for doing the impact assessment? We don't know. We are still in that analysis. The other thing is how we can automate and the whole process. So what kind of application, because when we do the assessment, so in our case, practically speaking, I start the assessment, I collect the initial information, I get from these 6 different subject areas, I start looking into what are the risks and impacts, and then I complete a first round of the assessment. Then this document goes to our colleagues in the Office of Equity and Human Rights, where it's being reviewed through a lens of civil liberties, civil rights, human rights, and it goes, in other part, it goes to our city attorneys, and they review the legal context of the assessment. And then I get all the feedback and comments. I put together the final report, and that's how it is. Now, there is a lot of subjectivity in doing a risk assessment. So the latest that also we are trying to do is try to remove that subjectivity by creating taxonomy of risks. And then that's what we're also doing right now. So creating a taxonomy of different risks, and regardless of who does the assessment, so we actually understand what are the risks, and we kind of just make the connections, and we understand how we can later compare apples to the specific technology. So if it's not only Hector who's doing the assessment with my expertise, I may have a lot of blind spots, and it doesn't matter. So if it's somebody else, this other person should come up with the same or very similar assessment regardless. So trying to remove that subjectivity is kind of one of our goals right now.
Yeah, interesting. That's the you started out then to invite the different perspective into the assessment of the not just for the privacy but also the many of the concerns in the citizens. Then, if you put of the more comprehensive taxonomies, it's very easy to assess in a different perspective. That's very knowledgeable for the other cities as well. Thank you for sharing the insights. So I think that you have a very great missions and the open data programs and the privacy by design, because the open data is very good for the citizens to processing of the data for the public interest. But in this sense, you mentioned the privacy is the key part of the elements, and under the European law, it's designed for this very critical to protect the human rights. So could you share about your envision then futures of the Fortran, the open data program, then the privacy by design?
Yeah, well, again, this is a landscape that is changing very often. So we, like 2020, again, COVID happened. We were in a different stage trying to figure things out. Now we are 2023. And now we have all this buzz around ChatGPT, applications of having artificial intelligence in a more mature stage, right? And then at the same time, we are having all these different crises coming to our doors, right? Here in Portland, for instance, 2 years ago, we had a heat dome where the city actually was the hottest place on earth. All this region, we were actually 49 degrees C, almost 50 degrees C, for 3 days. For 3 days. That was unbelievable and unbearable too. We have a number of people dead here, and many of those in my neighborhood, which, is what happens when you work locally. The things happen very close to you. So we have climate change, we have a crisis around housing, right? Renters and people who don't own a house, they usually displace. We have all these different issues. We need to be prepared for earthquakes. We need to be prepared for things happening here and there. And so those kind of worlds are colliding. So my vision for the future is just to try to be ready with the tools that we could use to try to resolve all these larger issues, around climate change, around human rights, your right for having a decent housing, right for education, a right for being old and having a reasonable life when we are old, right? Like healthcare, also healthcare for women, and it doesn't matter who you are. If you are Black, if you are a woman, if you have any disability, if you are an immigrant. So in our city, we all should be welcome or feel welcome and should have access to all these different benefits that our city should provide, in general. That's kind of my vision and my dream. I hope that technology could actually help us to get there. And we cannot do it just individually. We need to talk to each other, and that's why we are also constantly trying all these different engagement tools, creating the spaces for coming together and start talking to each other. We know we are different, right? We have different interests, but without talking to each other, this is not going to work. So we need to talk to each other, and I hope technology can help everybody on that regard.
Well, I didn't know that in very going up the high temperature is an important, but it's obviously the coming of the climate crisis.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention the air quality also. Like forest fires are awful. Very often we have also the worst air quality in the world. Like also 2 years ago, because of forest fires, air quality, usually, the regular meter goes up to 300. Well, we were 700. The sky was completely red. Like it was like not bearable outside.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very it's actually these the next decades we should solve the problems. Of course, the technology, but also the some of our actions from the civil rights. So thank you for sharing. So lastly, could you share any message to the listeners? I think you have the varieties of the experiences and also the initiatives so far, and that's a very helpful for listening. Then also they're very happy to collaborate in some ways.
Yeah, I think I understand also that the way in which we relate to technology is very cultural based. So different cultures, they relate to technology differently. And of course, through age, right? It's not the same when an elderly person goes and interact with a smartphone or any piece of technology here and there to a young person, a teenager, for instance, interacting with the technology, understanding what kind of information goes across, who's on the other side of the technology, who has access to the information. So, and that's a lot of work and thinking. And it's even worse when, if your context is that you are a single mom with 3 kids that you need to take care of and then take them to school, and you are not going to be thinking about artificial intelligence at all. But rather, I think we can actually start kind of sharing all these different experiences. I think that's the value of this collective effort and understanding. I would love one day, very soon, to go back to Japan and share also all these different experiences with colleagues there in Japan. I would love to host people from Japan here in Portland. I mean, you are welcome to visit us, to contact our office, visit our smartcitypdx.com website, send us an email, join our social network. Yeah, the city of Portland, I think, has a lot of projects like this to offer. So the city is working on sustainability issues, emergency preparedness, housing, transportation. So I think we can learn a lot from each other, and I'm looking forward to all those conversations in the future.
Yes, thank you for sharing your last message. It's a very good time to collaborate in the ways of the against of the social crisis to solve the problems by the sharing the insight together. So that's a great speaking with you this moment. So thank you for having Hector this time. I'm happy to engage with you for the future.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.